Hi everyone, so my name's Katie, and for the table topics presentation, I had chapter 8. I would also just like to throw out a little disclaimer that we have the flu running around at my work, so if I look or sound kind of crappy, my apologies in advance. So, a summary of chapter 8, it basically talked about discrimination within the healthcare setting and how people are treated differently based on superficial things such as your gender, age, color of your skin, how much money you come from, whether you're obese or malnourished, etc. So, the first thing I want to talk about is what is the sick role. And the sick role is a widely understood set of expectations regarding how people should or should not act when they are sick. And obviously, different cultures have different rules or guidelines on how you're supposed to act when you're sick. So the sick role will change country to country, religion to religion, etc. How does gender, age, and race, color of your skin affect your treatment? So unfortunately, we do know that racism and discrimination can happen to anyone for any number of reasons. And the little things, such as your gender, your age, or the color of your skin, can become big issues. In healthcare, we're going to see patients of every sort of background, but we still need to be aware that they are human and we need to treat them all the same. In Chapter 8, as well as both of the articles I found, discrimination against African Americans was significantly higher than the discrimination of whites. And yeah, so how wealth affects your health. Obviously, the more money you have or the more money you grew up with will significantly affect your healthcare treatment because the more money you come from or you have, um, the better treatment you'll be able to receive. Maybe you can travel and go to a different place that has a specialty or um, a place where you can go to receive better treatment or you can afford more expensive medications, etc. And then the obesity versus malnutrition. Obviously, both are a super big deal. 842 million people around the world are considered to be malnourished, while 32% of children and 68% of adults are considered to be obese. And both people who are obese and malnourished can receive quite a bit of discrimination against healthcare providers just because they think that they can get away with saying, honestly, some cruel statements to people who are obese or malnourished, and it's really not okay. So Article 1 was racial discrimination in the medical care setting and opioid pain reliever misuse in the US. So what is the definition of drug misuse? It is taking a medication in a manner or dose other than prescribed, taking someone else's prescription even if it's for a legitimate medical complaint such as pain, or taking a medication to feel euphoria. So that is the definition of drug misuse. So the study that was done in this article was completed in 1985 through 1986, and they recruited 5,114 African American and white people, and they were asked over several years if they ever experienced discrimination during medical treatment or as well as medications that they were prescribed, especially whether or not they misused the opioids that they were prescribed. And the results of the study said that 20.3% of African Americans and only 0.9% of white people reported experiencing discrimination within the healthcare setting. And then as for the opioid percentages, 5.8% of African Americans compared to the 8.0% of whites were less likely to own up to misusing the OPRs or opioid pain relievers. And then, according to the CDC, in 1999, African Americans were at a higher chance of misusing the opioids, while in 2002, whites were actually at a higher chance of misusing the opioids. And why did this change? So, in the article, it didn't really say why this changed. I was trying to kind of piece two and two together, and in my head, the only thing that I could come up with was after the study came out and they saw that um, in 1999 African Americans were misusing and overdosing on drugs, they tried to stop prescribing opioids to the African American race, which is why in 2002 the numbers flipped. That's kind of how I pieced that together. And how does this article relate to class? So I said specifically racial discrimination. So I chose this article because of how it talks about the opioid misuse and how that relates back to the racial discrimination, how it changed from the blacks or African Americans misusing and overdosing on these drugs to then the whites. I think this not only relates back to the chapter because of how people are treated differently within the medical setting versus or as well as what drugs they are being prescribed, but back to class as well. We have read several chapters about how people are treated differently because of the color of their skin. I also chose this article because I think it's important to realize that um, this doesn't just have to relate back to opioids. This is just with medical treatment in general. And the second article that I chose was Health and Wealth Association Among Older Americans, Racial and Ethnic Differences. So this article talked a lot about elderly discrimination as well as racial discrimination. So I think sometimes it's hard to wrap our heads around that elderly people can be discriminated against just as easy as someone in their 20s. And this actually happens quite frequently. So in this article, one of the the two big things that they talked about was how your income affects your health care and how wealth needs to be reevaluated. So as for the income, uh, excuse me. So in the second article, it said that the association between income and health was less significant for younger people than it was towards the elderly population. And then the example that I used for wealth in my essay was that if you took two sets of grandparents who made the same annual gross income, retired at the same age, um, one set of grandparents was totally healthy. They go for walks every day. They keep up with their health screenings every year. And then the other couple, they the grandma's healthy, but say the grandpa is suffering from Alzheimer's. While they might have made the same and retired with the same, the couple with the grandpa who has Alzheimer's is going to be lower on the wealth scale simply because they're paying more for different healthcare treatments for not only the Alzheimer's but the medication that they're on for it. Maybe they need to be put in a home because the grandma can't take care of them, etc. So they might be treated differently because they might not be considered to have as much money as the other set of grandparents. And how this article relates back to class, I chose this article because I think that it explained very well that discrimination does not just affect the color of your skin. It affects people of all different backgrounds, literally your age. Something super, super silly that you can't change. Like, okay, yeah. And then I said that sometimes it can be hard to wrap your head around the fact that everyone can be treated differently for superficial things. I think this article proved that any kind of discrimination can happen to anyone at any given time. We have talked in class about how people within different age groups get treated differently depending on what stage of life they're in. And I think this article painted a pretty good picture explaining that you don't really know what's going on in someone else's life until you sit down and actually get to know them and talk about it. And that you shouldn't just look at someone and try to imagine what's going on in their lives. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory to just not judge others. And then some questions that I have for the class are, what are some ways that we as future healthcare professionals can help change discrimination within the healthcare field? And then my second question is, what are some ways that we as future healthcare professionals can make sure that all of our patients are treated equally? I'm sure most of us are going for nursing, but I'm sure there are some of us who are respiratory therapy or physical therapy or whatever your field is. How can we make sure that we treat all of our patients equally? And then here are my citations.